Taking Stock with Vincent Wall.
Thanks to Skillnet Ireland, driving business success through innovative training and upskilling.
This is News Talk.
You're welcome to Taking Stock on News Talk. I'm Vincent Wall, and each week we take a wider view of some of the major shifts in the global economy and those closer to home. You can get in contact with us by emailing takingstock@newstalk.com or on Twitter @takingstocknt. Now, we're focusing in particular today on how companies can rise and fall and look at some of the more interesting and extreme examples throughout history. We're going to hear first from William Dalrymple, the acclaimed writer and historian and author of The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company. William, you're very welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, it's a fascinating book, William, about how a private enterprise managed through, I suppose, a mixture of force, duplicity, greed, to acquire so much wealth and power in what's now modern India, and effectively became the first global multinational company and dictated British government policy to such a degree. But bring us right back to the start, which is the end of the 16th century, to a guy called Customer Smythe and the setting up of a joint stock company.
Correct. Smythe was, I suppose, the sort of Richard Branson of his day. He was this sort of young entrepreneur with a bit of money. And he finds that his fortune, which was then based on importing spices from Venice and the Middle East, from Aleppo and Cairo, had been threatened by the Dutch, who had realized you didn't need to buy spices secondhand from the Arabs, but you could go direct to the producers in what's now Indonesia. And they had done a couple of expeditions sailing right round the Cape and heading off to what's now Java and Sumatra. And bringing spices back from there. And he realized the only way that he could save his fortune was to beat the Dutch at their own game and found an English East India Company. And this was the second or third company that had ever been founded. Up to then, most businesses were either guilds, where, for example, all the Suffolk weavers would gather together and pool their capital, go off to Bruges to buy textiles, or they were family businesses like the Medici Bank or Marco Polo and his uncle setting off to go and trade in China. And the Elizabethans had invented the corporation, which was a bunch of guys coming together, pooling their capital. And you didn't have to be an executive part of the company as you did with the guild. You could just put your money in and then take the profits. And the East India Company was his big bash at doing that, and they raised a lot of money. They had a big meeting in what's now Moorgate Fields, now rather grotty tube station on the edge of the city of London, but in those days, as its name implies, in the middle of some fields on the edge of London. And they raised enough money to buy a couple of ships, and off they sailed. And it was a huge success. The first expedition got all the way to the Moluccas. Just as they were arriving, a Portuguese ship was seen coming the opposite direction, and as all the crew were ex-Caribbean pirates, they simply landed on the Portuguese ship, transferred the contents into their own hold, and sailed back to London, where they sold the spices for £1 million. And that was the beginning of the East India Company.
And that first precedent, I suppose, for modern life, the joint stock company where investors get involved and have limited liability. We'll wind forward a little bit, William. They lost out on the spice routes to the Dutch, but the British, through the East India Company, basically did very well on wool and textiles. But coming into the 17th century, it was touch and go as to whether the British East India Company, these private investors in Britain, or their French equivalents would win out.
Correct. So initially they'd been in the spice trade in Indonesia. And as you said, the Dutch had deeper pockets, better ships. They were more sassy in business. And the English East India Company lost that battle. There was one point even a Dutch fleet sailed up the Thames and started bombarding all the villages in Kent and the dockyards. And so there's a deal. The British hand over the Spice Islands, particularly the Spice Island of Run. And they get in return a cold, grotty island in the middle of the Hudson Bay called Manhattan, which, of course, in the long run was a good deal. And at this point, rather like a kind of startup, that's, slightly lost its way after a few years, they refocus their business and they move from spices in Indonesia to textiles, particularly cotton and India. And this is the decision that really makes their fortune, because this is the moment that the Mughal Empire in 1640 is at its peak. The Taj Mahal is being built. This wonderful new aesthetic that the Mughals create informs all these beautiful textiles which are being made in India, whether in cotton or silk or other kalamkaris, taffetas, all these beautiful things which the Mughals are making. And the Mughals at this point are the biggest economy in the world. They make about 40% of the world's GDP, while England has about 7% of the world's GDP. It's a tiny player at this point. And by focusing on textiles and getting their hands on the Indian market and becoming effectively the international shippers for the Mughals, they create this economic giant, which within a century or two is trading not only in India, but trading across the seas to China, where it's buying tea. It grows opium in India, which it then sells to the Chinese. It then takes the Chinese tea, it sells it in India, in Europe, and also in America. And it's East India Company tea, which is dubbed into Boston Harbor at the Boston Tea Party. So by the 18th century, the East India Company's moved from being this kind of small-scale Tudor business with a couple of ships to the world's first great multinational. And as you say, it's rivals of the French. Both the French and the English have access to the latest military technology. In the 18th century, Frederick the Great has just completely revolutionized how people fight battles. It's now all about infantry and file firing and moving cannons around battlefields. And the company realizes, this isn't rocket science. If you can train a bunch of Scots Highlanders to do this, you can certainly train a bunch of brilliant Tamil Brahmins. And that's what they do. They train up a huge army, so that by the end of the 18th century, the East India Company, which is still a private company owned by investors, it's got nothing to do with the British government at all in formal terms. The East India Company has an army of 200,000 troops, which is exactly double the size of the British army. So it's like Facebook or Google having fighter jets and nuclear weapons. I mean, it's an extraordinary moment in history when you've got a private company based in one London office. It's not a very big office, and still just 5 windows wide in Leadenhall Street in the middle of the city. But from this one office, you have not just a land empire in India, but also this enormous army, one of the largest modern armies in the world.
And was it that not just the scale of their military prowess, but their technological superiority for a brief period in the mid-18th century that allowed it to effectively take control from what was a very powerful Mughal empire? Or was there dissent from within the Mughal empire itself as well?
It's a bit of both. You're quite right. Technology plays a big part. And for about 40 years, between about 1740 and 1780, when the Indian rulers catch up and realize that they can do this too, and put these remarkable armies into the field to take on the company. For 40 years, they've got this moment. But the two things that have really played into the hands of both the English and the French, who are the rivals, who are both trying to get their hands on India, is, first of all, the breakup of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire had been this huge, massive, rich empire of 4 million men under arms, with the largest gross domestic product in the world. It was a massive textile giant, and also the richest ruler. The Mughal Emperor was simply the richest ruler in the world, full stop. But what also plays into the hands is that as this enormous empire fractures into thousands of little pieces, and dog is eating dog, every town is attacking the neighbor, and all these different forces are trying to build their own new little empire in the ruins of the Mughal Empire, rather like the end of the Roman Empire. What really distinguishes the company is that the Indian bankers realize that the East India Company speaks the same language about them. They understand about loans. They understand about repaying with interest on time. And just as India is dissolving into these competing warlord powers, the Indian bankers, one after another, decide to back the company for reasons of profit. They realize that they're going to get their money back with these guys. If they invest in the company, they will become rich. It's that simple. It's all about money. So the company, with a bit of extra technology, but with the backing of the Indian business classes, just fights battle after battle. And these were battles that were once famous. British school kids used to learn about this stuff: the Battle of Plassey, the Battle of Buxar, the Battle of Assaye. But it's in this extraordinary post-colonial amnesia that's taken over the British. They just don't teach it anymore in British schools. So you have a situation where Irish kids know all about the wickedness of the British Empire and the potato famine, and Indian kids know about the wickedness of the British Empire and how Gandhi and Nehru freed India. The only people that don't know about the British Empire is the British, because they're simply not taught it in their schools. And you get these embarrassing moments. I've seen it in Ireland and I've seen it in India when Brits turn up assuming that they have this glorious past, and they're told in no uncertain terms that their forebears created havoc wherever they went.
And I suppose the most
it was really
inglorious period of the English East India Company in India, William, was after they gained control after some of those battles, and with Indian banking support, I suppose from the 1750s to the 1770s, where they, like any multinational corporation, when they get control, they asset stripped with huge depredation of the local population.
Correct. That's exactly what happens. Having been in India since about 1600, they really start gobbling up chunks of territory in the 1750s. 1757 is the Battle of Plassey, 1765 is the Battle of Buxar. And these two battles leaves this multinational company, not the British government, but this company, this corporation, in charge of most of northern India. And at this point, their employees, who are paid quite small salaries and are expected to augment those salaries with private trading, they are let loose. And now that there's no army or Indian police force or anything to rein them in, they literally just loot the place. Loot is an Indian word. It means to plunder, and it enters the English language very significantly at this point. And so Bengal, which had 1 million weavers and was one of the very richest industrial areas in the globe, is literally just sort of ransacked by these unregulated traders who could do anything. They can force people to buy their goods. They can sell things at double their value, buy things at half the cost. And they can use the taxes that they raise in India from the people they've conquered to buy the goods they want to sell. So it's a kind of, incredibly profitable enterprise. And when you go around Britain today and you see a house like any of the big 18th century houses tended to be built not with agricultural wealth, but either from the loot of India or the slave trade. And this is something which, we have to come to terms with in Britain, that these gorgeous houses that look as if Colin Firth is about to sort of, wade through a lake and delight a women in Jane Austen bonnets. These were built on the back of the looting of India or the exploitation of the slaves in the Caribbean.
Our guest here on News Talk is William Dalrymple. We're talking to him about his latest book, The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company. And on that basis, things actually got so out of hand with this private corporation in India in the late 1770s, 1780s, William, that the British government was forced to get involved. But it found, and here again, I suppose, antecedents of what we've seen in modern political and corporate life. It found that the East India Company had huge influence through individual MPs, effectively bought them.
Correct. There's a number of ways the East India Company exerts its influence. And this is the nursery, if you like, for modern multinationals. This is the first time that a corporation finds that it has more money than many nation states, which is, obviously the case with the big corporations today like Amazon or Facebook or Google, all of which are much, much more wealthy than most of the world's nations. Or even ExxonMobil, the oil company, if that was a nation, it would be the eighth richest nation in the world. So the company uses its money in a variety of ways. First of all, it uses it to bribe MPs. And as early as 1690, that's within the first century of the company, the world's first corporate bribery scandal breaks when it's found that the East India Company is literally handing share options to MPs if they vote for the extension of its monopoly. So this is the equivalent, the 18th century equivalent of Muhammad al-Fayed stuffing brown paper envelopes with used notes and handing it to MPs. The second thing that happens is that these guys, after they've made their fortunes in India by looting and asset stripping India, come back and buy the rotten boroughs, these constituencies that are basically up for sale to the highest bidder. And so within a few years, the company's actually got its own faction within Parliament. And it can tell their East India Company MPs just to vote in such a way that serves the company's interests. But most familiar of all, you've got this system whereby about half the MPs actually have shares in the East India Company. So for their own financial interests, they are voting for particular bills in Parliament, which give the company more power and allow it to rampage around the globe. And so by the 1780s, the company has become the Georgian equivalent of the Medellin cartel. They are the largest narco operation in history. And the East India Company goes on a little later to fight two opium wars, seizing Hong Kong so that it can command the illegal opium trade into China. And I mean, these are incredibly shameful and wicked bits of history that we really need to know much more about.
As we get towards the end of the 18th century, its technological military superiority is over, its trading performance begins to suffer, it gets into debt. But again, I suppose another echo from the past, the British government, which has watched it, but not directly involved, it's too big to allow it to fail.
Correct. So in the 1770s, there's this enormous famine in India. It's not caused by the company, but they do nothing to alleviate it. Again,
that has echoes, yes.
Familiar to the Irish, and they don't. There have been famines throughout Indian history, but normally rulers would step in. They'd set up soup kitchens. They'd have mass employment schemes where people were paid a few rupees a day to build, an enormous mosque or a imambara or whatever it was, and so people wouldn't starve. But the company, by a mixture of greed and incompetence, simply doesn't do that. The famine of 1770 comes. It's been exacerbated by the way the company's assets stripped Bengal and picked it to the bone. They don't set up a soup kitchen. They don't do a single thing. And they actually insist on the full gathering of taxes. And they send their armies, which are there, to wage war against neighboring states. They send the armies out into the countryside and literally hang anyone that doesn't pay their full taxes. So for a couple of years, this keeps the company solvent. And indeed, the shareholders in London at the annual general meeting, despite knowing that 1 million Bengalis have died in the famine, vote to increase their annual dividend from 10 to 12.5%.
Wow.
In celebration of the fact that they've gathered taxes despite the famine. But by 1772, there is no more taxes to gather. The place has been literally stripped dry. The larder is empty. And at that point, the company gets into massive debt. They go to the Bank of England, but their Bank of England hasn't got enough money to bail them out, so they have to go to Parliament. And this is the first moment, as late as 1774, the company's been going 170 years, but this is the first moment the government gets involved. And rather like with the collapse of NatWest, in the bank collapses of 2008, the government basically buys a share of the East India Company, a controlling share. And from that moment, the East India becomes a kind of semi-nationalized institution with more and more government control. And that rolls on until about 1858, when the whole East India Company is nationalized. There's been the Great Uprising, what the English call the Indian Mutiny, what the Indians call the First War of Independence. And when the company wins that and inflicts massive war crimes across northern India, killing perhaps 100,000 people, innocent civilians as well as the actual rebels, Parliament steps in and effectively nationalizes the East India Company. And that's when you get the Raj. The Raj, which is so familiar from British TV screens, from Gandhi and The Jewel in the Crown, all those guys in solar topis and empire building shorts. All that thing begins in 1858. But what's weird is that the Raj, which was only 90 years, has dominated our view and our vision of the British in India. We have forgotten completely, partly because the Victorians sort of erased it from history, that the great majority of the time the British were in India, in other words, from 1600 to 1858, which is 250 years, that period, it was just run as a business by the East India Company. And there was no talk in those days of, a civilizing mission or building the railways or this sort of pretense that somehow Britain was in India for the sake of the Indians. The East India Company, for all its failings, was very clear about it, what it was there for. It was there for profit. It was there to make money. It was there for the shareholders. And the East India Company did that very effectively. And, the East India Company played a major role in moving England from being, frankly, a fairly marginal player in Europe on the edge. The rich countries in the Middle Ages were Italy, Spain, and France. But by the mid-18th century, the growing economy and the money that's seeding what will become the Industrial Revolution at the end of the 18th century, this is coming from two sources, from India and from the Caribbean slave trade. So this is this is one of the crucial bits of history. And we must remember that this was corporate history. This was not the British government doing it. This was much more sinister than that. It was like Google taking over Africa, or Facebook, doing a coup and taking over a chunk of Latin America. I mean, I suppose the nearest equivalent today would be Huawei or one of these big Chinese companies.
Yeah, and you referenced there, I suppose, our knowledge here in Ireland of the colonial exploitation visited upon us, William, by both the British state and by individuals that came here. But a lot of Irish individuals and indeed Scottish individuals, your antecedents, actually went to try and make their fortune through the East India Company.
Yep, absolutely right. The Scots were particularly active in the East India Company. In fact, one of the provisos of the Act of Union in 1707 was that the Scottish elite would be allowed to get a chunk of East India Company interest. So many MPs, my forebears included, were able to give out what are called writerships, in other words, places in the East India Company for people to make money. And the Scots were proportionately even more successful in the East India Company than the English. And, we love to think of ourselves as victims of the English, but we certainly, in a sense, were the bully in this case. And the Scots are responsible for many of the worst atrocities and some of the worst looting that took place in India. The Irish slightly less so, but the Irish certainly played a major role in the East India Company army. And the East India Company army was effectively a mercenary army. It was a corporate security force. It wasn't a national army in the sense that the British army or the French army was. It was an army owned by a corporation, and many ordinary Irish people signed up for that. It had an incredible fatality rate. I think only 1 in 4 people that joined the East India Company army ever came home again. But when they did, they often came with a fortune because they had the right to loot if they took a city by storm. So, for example, in 1799, the company defeats its longtime rival, Tipu Sultan, who previously has inflicted many defeats on the company. 1799, they finally take his city, Srirangapatnam, in South India. And the ordinary soldiers have the right to a share of the loot. And many come home with bits of gold or tigers' heads or jeweled swords or something, which they then sell. And to this day, in Ireland and in Scotland, as well as in England, you find items of loot from Tipu Sultan's palace sitting in the most unlikely places in the Dingle Peninsula or in Shropshire or in Perthshire.
Okay, we'll leave it there. It's an absolutely fascinating story, as you've heard there from William, the author himself, and with so many echoes that's still with us in terms of corporate life and the interactions between politics and business. But that's William Dalrymple, the acclaimed writer and historian and author of The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company. William, thanks indeed for joining us.
Thanks so much. Very kind to have me.
Taking Stock on News Talk.
Thanks to Skillnet Ireland, driving business success through innovative training and upskilling.
We'll hear next from Thomas Grita, the Wall Street journalist and co-author of Lights Out, Pride, Delusion and the Fall of General Electric. Thomas, you're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Now, GE, I suppose, became the model for American capitalism, particularly in the late 20th century under its then leader, Jack Welch, Thomas. And I suppose in more recent years, as it disintegrated and became a shadow of itself, I suppose it became the embodiment in many eyes of all the malign fruit of aggressive capitalism. But first, before we discuss those, it has an illustrious corporate history, though it wasn't, as some think, myself included, I have to admit, founded by the entrepreneurial inventor Thomas Edison.
That's right. It was, put together partly of some of his old companies in a series of mergers that were really coordinated by the financier J.P. Morgan. I mean, it was mostly a business move. You needed a huge company to pursue the electrification of the country, but it was not. Edison was barely involved in GE itself. He sold his shares pretty quickly to fund a mining venture that actually didn't work out. So yeah, it's not, as far as marketing is concerned, GE certainly uses Edison. His old companies were part of what GE was, but there wasn't much of a direct connection.
But it became a relative giant pretty soon after its founding in the late 19th century and was one of the founding members of the Dow Jones Stock Exchange Index.
Yeah, that's right. And was for decades and decades considered almost a reflection of the economy itself. It was just, so big in so many different industries, strong stock, paying dividends, creating who were considered to be elite managers. It really was seen as a prime example of what a company could be.
Right through the 20th century, but then I suppose in the early 1980s, it really took off and grabbed global attention by its performance under Jack Welch, Neutron Jack. He didn't like the name, but he became synonymous with it, and I suppose rightly so, in the sense that he was so aggressive in his acquisitive nature, in how he weeded out what he saw as non-performing employees and getting those quarterly numbers every time.
That's definitely one way to think about it. The other way is that he was really aggressive about costs. He was always trying to keep costs down. He was really focused on operations, and of course that is to keep the profits up. He did sort of notoriously, rank employees, and if they weren't able to improve their performance, they were out of the company. That's a system that is not really used today anymore.
170,000 employees got rid of effectively in his first 10 years in charge. Now, by the time he stepped down in the early 21st century, 2001, he had been named Fortune magazine's Manager of the Century in 1999. GE was the most valuable company on the New York stock market, probably in the world by market valuation, $130 billion. And it was across a whole range of sectors, from aircraft engines to broadcasting with NBC to a plethora of consumer goods companies. But Jack Welch had significantly got it into financial services, and that was delivering a huge element of its profits by the time he stepped down.
That's right. GE always had a financial services arm, and actually started decades ago to help people buy GE's appliances, to help finance them. But it really transformed into a bank, one that was not under the oversight that regular banks would be. They essentially used the excellent credit rating of the industrial business to fund loans that it could then lend out that money at a higher rate. And it was a very easy way to make money. I think Jack was surprised at how easy it was to make money that way. And when you're trying to make the numbers, that's a great tool to have in your toolbox.
And I suppose it was one of the fault lines in the company as things turned out. But Jeff Immelt takes over from Jack Welch in 2001. He's a long-standing GE executive himself. He's selected by Jack Welch to succeed him. What starts slowly going wrong? Has he inherited fault lines from Jack Welch, or was he just unlucky because he was immediately hit by 9/11 and all of that? Or did he get many things wrong himself?
It really is a combination of all of those things. Jeff certainly inherited problems from Welch, and he also caused some of his own. Financial services grew under Jeff in those early years. The world also changed a lot while Jeff was running the company. You mentioned we have 9/11, you have Enron and a number of other corporate crises that have happened that reform how companies use their accounting. It improved their transparency, and it made it harder to sort of do the things that happened under Jack. You could raise the question of, could anyone have done the job that he was given in such a changing world?
That said, the financial services business, which basically had loaned out huge amounts of money, and which I suppose there were perhaps fast and loose accounting practices before all that regulatory situation cleaned itself up, it hit the skids in 2008 with the financial crisis.
Absolutely. The wheels really flew off. They served a part of the market that a lot of banks didn't, but it meant they had all sorts of various financial instruments that they held, whether it was bad mortgages or financing McDonald's franchisees or you name it. They really were willing to sort of fund anything because they didn't have that regulation. And when the crisis came, I think a lot of people, including bank regulators, were shocked to hear that General Electric was under stress. Again, they were funding a lot of their financial services business through the industrial business, which was using commercial paper. So it was a short-term debt that they were issuing, and they were essentially borrowing short and lending long. And that can really expose you if times change and rates start to shift, or if you can't borrow.
And that crisis, when it hit in 2008, and of course a lot of blue chip aristocratic corporates in America were hitting the same skids, but that crisis went right up to the White House and to the Treasury Secretary to see what could be done. And in the end, Warren Buffett had to come in with an emergency loan.
That's right. Warren Buffett famously made an investment. I think he made the decision in his bathrobe early in the morning. He saw value in General Electric because, frankly, they do have a lot of good businesses. They do make jet engines and healthcare machines, and they're very global. But for Buffett to come in, sure, GE needed the cash, but getting Buffett to sign on was quite a signal to the market that he had that confidence, and so others could have that confidence as well.
They got through that, and Immelt did his best to try to sell off non-performing businesses and to try and, I suppose, bring more unity to what had become a sprawling industrial conglomerate. But a lot of criticism that the acquisitions he made came too late when others had spotted the trend in advance, and then he spent too much on them. And I'm thinking particularly of Alstom of France.
Oh, sure. The Alstom deal was definitely one of the parts of shifting the company more towards an industrial company and away from financial services. Another factor there was that all the cash that came in from them dismantling most of the financial services business was largely used on stock buybacks. And then you're right, they pursue a number of deals, Alstom being by far the biggest. And they were buying a company that was on hard times itself in a market that was going to decline greatly, which is, power generation, natural gas and coal. And there was a long review of that deal with France. And although Alstom's business declined or deteriorated over that time, GE stuck to it. They didn't walk away. Management felt that was the right deal that would really give them what they needed in the power business. And it did not go that way. And ultimately, the power business was a huge issue for them even today.
Our guest here on News Talk is Thomas Greite, Wall Street journalist and co-author of Lights Out, Pride, Delusion and the Fall of General Electric. Let's wind forward to, I think, 2017, and Jeff Immelt's reputation is declining. Investors and shareholders are getting more and more concerned about the falling share price and what's happening in the company. He steps down and another long-standing executive, John Flannery, takes over. He lasts less than a year and GE falls out of the Dow Jones almost for the first time in its history.
That's right. I think it's important to remember that when John was running the business, he was sort of uncovering, if you want to view it that way, some of the problems inside the company, in the power business, how bad things were, and that the company actually didn't have enough cash to be paying its dividend regularly. John, I think, spent a long time analyzing the situation. He cared deeply about the company, and there was some frustration among investors and among the board that he wasn't moving fast enough given the urgency that was needed. And he was replaced. He was replaced by the lead director, Larry Culp. And again, you could argue that John, it may have been an impossible task for him, given that he was an insider. Could someone fix GE's problems that were so difficult, and someone who was internal, who was connected to that culture?
The title of your book, Thomas, is Pride, Delusion and the Fall of General Electric. That signals to me, and from reading the book, it signals to me that GE's rise and fall wasn't just a reflection of what was happening in the American economy and what was happening in terms of capitalism at the time, that the egos of those who led the company, particularly Welch and perhaps to a lesser extent Immelt, and their feeling that their brand of capitalism and their management style could tackle any problem or manage any company that they bought in any sector, that those elements were also a significant element in its rise and fall.
Yeah, there was that hubris, right? That they thought if they bought a company that it was worth more simply because they owned it, that their management practices could run any type of company, that they had sort of solved business in some ways. And that just wasn't true. And you could see how that could get you into trouble. But GE was so large for so long that missteps didn't really show up on the radar. But you can only do that for so long. You can only say, we can get through it because we're so big and we're GE. But eventually it does catch up to you, especially if you're taking risk on a larger scale.
Welch, of course, had a notorious ego. He wrote a number of books about himself. He set up an executive academy to teach managers, ironically, I suppose, looking back on it. And he immediately started sniping at Immelt almost as soon as he himself appointed him. But Immelt was a different character, perhaps less flashy, but hubris enough in his own way. He had a second private plane he didn't even tell the board about. And he was conceited enough about his management prowess.
Yeah, I think that's right. As the years went by, being chairman and CEO of one of the world's biggest companies, and he was really optimistic, that idea that GE could, work out any problem. He really felt that way. He was always sort of spinning it positive. Jack was much more about operations. He did go on to teach his sort of management styles. And, it's not that there necessarily were any problem or that even Jeff had a bad approach to management. But, given the problems, it just wasn't probably suited for the complexities that arose in the business.
We've talked on this programme over many months about the cycles in capitalism and management styles. And to what degree do you think the story of GE over the last 40 years, Thomas, has reflected huge changes in management and business approach? I mean, under Welch, to a lesser extent Immelt, they acquired hugely, they accumulated huge debts to acquire massively. Each gentleman was both chairman and chief executive, so probably weren't challenged sufficiently by the board in terms of their style, question marks over their governance, and I suppose put short-term numbers, quarterly performance before their employees, whom they were pretty aggressive with.
Yeah, I think that performance culture was very intense, and they were dealing with a conglomerate model that is very much antiquated. Being able to manage all different industries under one company is incredibly hard, and I think the market itself has changed. Really, investors are looking for companies that are focused, that really are optimizing their operations. GE, in order to run and oversee all those companies, had a thick corporate layer of people and management that weren't involved in those businesses. And it wasn't very efficient. It was costly. Whereas GE viewed that as being something that added value, whereas investors didn't see it that way. Conglomerates have very much gone out of favor, and GE sort of survived the earlier extinction.
And to what degree was that lack of corporate governance an issue in the sense that the board wasn't strong enough to challenge some of the decisions they made?
Yeah, I mean, with Jeff being CEO and chairman, that's another larger corporate issue that you can debate. A lot of companies still have that structure, including GE. It still has that structure. You have someone who's running the board, who is essentially the boss of the board, and is also the head executive of the company. The board's ability to challenge Jeff, I think, was there. I don't think you just give the board a pass. It's not the chairman's fault entirely. There were certainly people who asked hard questions and made hard suggestions, and some of them were pushed off the board. But that's a real question. Should the board have had more insight when you have the CEO and the chairman in the same role, who's able to choose who will be on that board and to a good extent control the information that board is getting?
And where does it go from here, Thomas? It's a much slimmer company now, but it's just another company on the stock exchange now, as distinct from the company GE was right through the 20th century. Could it be broken up further? Could it slim down even further?
Of course, you could definitely undergo further changes. The current CEO, Larry Kolb, has said this is going to be a multi-year turnaround. They have a lot of debt. They've worked hard selling off assets to raise a lot of cash. The pandemic has certainly been a bit of a perfect storm for them. They were largely exposed to Boeing's problems, so that hit them. And now with people flying so much less, it's really hit GE hard. Now, even if you assume it's going to take a few years for them to turn around, you ask, could it be broken up more? Certainly. I mean, they still, for a bit, they were talking of separating their healthcare business, which makes MRI machines and CT scanners and such. They certainly could do that in the future. You could ask whether a company that makes jet engines and makes large turbines to generate power needs to own a healthcare company. I think the final form of GE is yet to be seen. I don't think anyone is willing to say that GE won't be around. But I think your assessment that it is sort of just another company is accurate.
How the mighty have fallen, but I suppose 130, 140 years on, it still has some sort of a pulse. Fascinating story. That's Thomas Greitha, Wall Street journalist and co-author of Lights Out, Pride, Delusion and the Fall of General Electric. Thomas, thanks very much for joining us.
No, thanks for having me so much. Take care.
Taking Stock on News Talk.
Thanks to Skillnet Ireland, driving business success through innovative training and upskilling.
We're going to hear next from Vincent Boland, journalist and commentator on business and finance. Vincent, you're very welcome and thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here, Vincent. Thank you.
Let's go back to this now.
We engaged advisors at considerable expense. We made them work for their money. And then the Cabinet Subcommittee came for a a meeting and a series of meetings, and as a result of that we decided on the offer price of 307. It would be totally inappropriate to start deliberating as to who said what at any of those meetings, but I think the offer price of 307 is a fair one.
That was the Minister for Finance at the time, July 1999, Champagne Charlie McCreevy, speaking on the day of the flotation of what had been Telecom Éireann, the state's telecom system, as Eircom onto the stock exchange. You and I have talked on this programme before, Vincent, about the whole rise of popular capitalism in the UK during the 80s with Big Bang and the flotation of a lot of their state companies. This was Ireland's first go at popular capitalism, and we really sold it hard, didn't we?
Absolutely. There was a massive marketing campaign, and I think the most astonishing fact about it today is that more than 500,000 Irish people invested money in Telecom Éireann when it was floated. I find that absolutely astonishing. I was actually living abroad at the time, so it kind of passed me by in that sense. So I'm one of the few Irish people who didn't lose money on Telecom Éireann. But
I am as well. I have to put my hands up here. I was editor of Business and Finance magazine at the time, and as you say, I think about 550,000 retail investors bought. About 50,000 sold again within the first month when the share price had actually appreciated by about 20%. I was one of those, not through any great financial foresight. I just needed the cash at the time. But most people stayed in, and they stayed in because they had been encouraged by government with a big fancy marketing campaign to buy in the first place. But to stay in this, they couldn't go wrong.
Absolutely. This was sold as a long-term investment in a key piece of Irish infrastructure. It was going to be modernised. It was going to transform itself and the way we communicated, etc., etc. And that was, I think, the prospectus on which Telecom Éireann was sold was a key piece of infrastructure, and it was a long-term investment that would be successful over the long term.
And about 3 years previously, the government had gone out and got two major European telecoms companies at the time, KPN of Holland and Telia of Sweden, to buy in, to take strategic stakes in the company. And this was part of the encouragement, I suppose, that here we have two big strategic partners who will help revolutionise the system as well. They're long-term investors. So you guys pile on board, wear the green jersey, and you'll make a few bob over time as well. Yes,
and the investments from KPN and Telia were of a trend in Europe at the time, and actually globally. Were in-demand asset, and they were the number privatisation lists of every government. I was living in Central Europe at the time, covering the transition from communism to capitalism for the Financial Times, and one of the big stories that I followed when I was living in Prague in the mid-90s was the privatisation of Czech Telecom, which was almost a carbon copy of the way that the Irish telecoms was privatised. In that case, they sold a big stake to a foreign company. I forget which one, but there were several candidates. It was a very competitive process, and the Czech state made a lot of money. So telecoms were a huge in-demand asset at the time, and Telecom Éireann and the sale of Telecom Éireann fed into that trend, and that's why I think it happened when it did and in the circumstances in which it did.
Now, we heard Charlie McCreevy say there that the Cabinet had given it much consideration on the basis of financial advice to set a flotation price of 307. That was punts, of course, just before we changed to the euro. The equivalent of about €3.90. The share price did go up to 470 within a month, 20% gain, as had been expected. But most people expected more if they held on, and even when it began to dip, they held on. But looking back now, part of the reason that we went into disaster was the flotation price was too high, and that was partly because it was over-marketed. There was over-demand from Johnny in the street.
Absolutely. One of the factors that you take into account in setting the price of a company to be sold to the public is public demand, and it was massively inflated. It was artificial demand. It was over-marketed, as you said. I think that was justified in the first month or so, but within 12 months, I think it began to be clear that actually it was completely overpriced and that it was sold under almost false pretenses. This over-marketing, this over-hyping of an asset that by any objective measure was, and also ran in the European or global telecom stakes, and went on to make successive mistakes strategically in the future. Clearly, it was not fit for purpose. It was a very poorly run company, and it was worth much less than the privatisation would have told us.
Yeah, looking back on the numbers now, I think the value of the company was, in euro terms, about 1.2 billion euro in assets, but it had debts of half a billion. So it was in a small country, not particularly strong balance sheet at the time. Within a month or two of flotation, the share price started to dip quite alarmingly. Within a year, by the summer of 2000, it was down 30%. And the management then of the public company, as it was, began to take strategic decisions that ultimately left it open to private sector predators. The first one being they decided to sell off their fast-growing and most profitable unit, Aircel.
Yes, I mean, that was the biggest mistake of all. I mean, how in the early noughties the management of a telecoms company, regardless of its origins, could decide that selling the mobile unit was the smart thing to do is beyond me. I just do not understand that. That was a colossal error. And to an extent, the things that have happened to Eircom as it became are a result of that strategic mistake. It left it very vulnerable to companies or investors with an eye for a quick turnover. It was generating cash, certainly, as every telecoms company does, but it doesn't take any sort of particular management genius to generate cash. But having gotten rid of the one asset that might help it grow, then all you had was a sort of static pool of cash-generating assets that were not going to grow because, people stopped buying or installing landlines after a while. I mean, the infrastructure that it had was very valuable, and you could leverage that to get competitors and governments to pay up to use that. But I mean, selling the mobile was a complete disaster, and I think it was the moment when the bell began to toll, really, for Telecom Éireann.
And obviously the government, when it sold back in 1999 and made about 6 billion euro out of it, it has to be said. But when they sold, one, they didn't obviously foresee that a major strategic part of the company could be sold so quickly by its new management. Two, they had expected Telia and KPN to stay on as strategic investors for some time. They suddenly decided that they were going to leave because of changes in Europe. And they really don't seem to have foreseen that quite quickly, because of those changes, Telecom Eircom could be privatised, could be taken private by predators outside.
Exactly, yes. I mean, as soon as you privatise a company, you lose control of it. Right? That is by definition the case. And it's not surprising that Telia and KPN, after a while, would have said, actually, our Irish asset is surplus to requirements. Because while telecoms companies are, they tend to be big incumbents with lots of cash and lots of debt and lots of employees and lots of costs, right? And Eircom was all of those things, right? So after selling the mobile, I think investors began to look at Eircom's cost base. And one of the reasons why I think it became attractive to investors was, particularly sort of private equity or quick buck merchant investors, I'll call them, was that they could see an asset here that had lots of potential but huge cost base that could be cut very easily. So that's, I think, a reason why it became a kind of plaything of certain types of corporate investor.
Within 18 months of the flotation that was effectively going to set up Eircom and its literally hundreds of thousands of Irish retail investors on a solid path to growth as a publicly quoted company, a battle ensued between two of the biggest business titans of the time, a consortium led by Tony O'Reilly, the old bull in the field, so to speak, and Dennis O'Brien of this parish, who was a young telecoms entrepreneur with his own Digifone and ESAT operations here. They got into a major battle to buy the company and take it private.
Yes, I mean, they were the first investors to see that there was potential gold mine inside Eircom, or whatever it was called at the time, and between its operations, which are heavily cash generative, and its cost base, which could be cut very easily. So I'm not surprised that well-financed investors would have come in and done that. And it's not surprising that the first two to do so were homegrown, because they were, they had long experience of it. They were looking at it very closely. And, Dennis O'Brien already had a telecoms empire. So it was a kind of natural thing for them to do if they were looking around in their domestic markets for something to buy.
Tony O'Reilly's consortium, called Valencia, with backing from George Soros and Goldman Sachs, it eventually won that battle. It paid €3 billion for Eircom, literally in the summer of 2001, 2 years after it floated. The original market valuation at flotation day was €10.5 billion, so they were getting it at one third of the price. And I suppose it led to a succession of sales and buyouts where the private investors bought and actually put the debt associated with their purchase on the balance sheet of Eircom, which apart from anything else meant that the company would have no funds to invest in the Irish telecom structure.
Yes, I mean, this is one of the problems with private equity investment and sort of consortium investment like that, is that they borrow heavily to buy the company, and then they put that company onto the balance sheet of that debt onto the company, onto the balance sheet of the company, and to all intents and purposes, the company ends up buying itself, right? And that happened in a series of transactions at Eircom between 2001 and today, right? And as you said, the servicing of that debt cost almost all of the cash generation that this company was making went on debt servicing. So clearly it had no money to invest. And you can tell today that, you know, Eircom is not Ireland's number one phone company by any stretch of the imagination, right? It should be, but it isn't.
It's the biggest, but perhaps not the most influential.
Exactly. And I think it clearly missed the trick with the mobile arm. And at the time that it was floated, sort of start-up mobile companies were still relatively rare, and certainly they were very rare in Ireland, so maybe Eircom didn't see a threat from there. But that was the threat coming down the line, and nobody seemed to see it. So it was exceptionally vulnerable, strategically and also from a financial point of view, by the mid-noughties. That was the problem with it.
From that date in the summer of 2001, literally to date, I think there's been 6 turnovers of private equity investors, now largely owned by companies associated with the French entrepreneur Xavier Niels. And in each occasion, the purchase is heavily funded by debt. The debt goes on the balance sheet. The company has to pay significant dividends to the new owners. It has to pay significant bank debt, very little investment. And in fact, by 2012, it has to go into examinership, the biggest examinership to date in Irish history. It's a sad story. Let's look back, and a lot of Irish punters who invested in the stock at the time still have difficult memories of it. The winners and the losers. There weren't all losers. 50,000 people did get out in the first month, myself included. The unions and the employees who were part of Telecom Éireann in 1999 did very well in all sorts of ways.
Yes, and I think the state did very well, you could argue. From a cash generation point of view, I think, was it 6 billion euros in total it made from the sale, which is actually astonishing when you think about it.
Now, 1 billion of that immediately had to go in to fill the deficit in the Telecom Éireann staff members' pension.
Yes.
So immediately their pension deficit was filled. They were sold shares in the new company at 1/3 of the price. They got 15% of the shares in the company, and they made very nice money over the coming years.
Yes, that's right. So that was the second sort of key constituency, I think, that made cash, that made money out of it, and the handful of investors who sold as the share price was rising. So you can easily identify those 3, but that still leaves 500,000 ordinary Irish people who lost money and continue to lose money on their Telecom Éireann investment. So they're nursing losses that they'll never essentially get back, because the company is completely different now to what it was, and it has almost no private shareholders anymore.
Although a lot of those investors did get Vodafone shares when Aircel was sold to Vodafone back in 2000, 2001. You know, they didn't expect to become Vodafone shares. They have, I suppose, made dividends out of that over time. But by and large, not a positive experience.
No.
And it influenced, I suppose, the punters' attitude to privatisation of Irish state assets, and particularly the attitude of future governments.
Absolutely it did. I think that Telecom Éireann, the way that Telecom Éireann was privatised and what happened to it subsequently, really is a sort of textbook case of doing it in the wrong way and harvesting the wrong conclusions and the wrong results from it. First of all, it was completely overpriced. Worst of all, it was oversold, right, overhyped on the day of sale. The only way really forward from there was down, because it had been taken as high as it could go. So that is one issue. Then you have the question of the ownership of the company after privatisation and how it was allowed to become a kind of doll, a plaything of predatory investors who were not fundamentally investors. They were not infrastructure or telephone investors, right? They were financial investors. They were speculators. How it became the plaything of those types of investors is another reason why I think it's a very poor illustration of how to do a privatisation. I have nothing against privatisation whatsoever, and certainly it is not the job of any government to be in the phone providing business, let's face it. But the way this one was handled, I think, will make future privatisations of Irish state assets, to the extent that they exist, very difficult. And the classic example of reaping the costs of privatising telecom in the way it was privatised is Irish Water. I recall in 2014 and 2015, having just come back to Ireland after spending a long time abroad, that the creation of Irish Water and the structure of it and charging for water became the big issue, the big sort of public issue. And one of the many factors was that people were adamant that Irish Water could not be privatised. Again, I had no problem with that. It's a monopoly, therefore its best ownership is in the hands of the public through the state. Unfortunately, the government was completely unable to sort of get the message, but not only to get the message, but also to articulate that absolutely we understand this and there is not going to be any privatisation of Irish Water. Unfortunately, the way that they went about structuring Irish Water, they were almost creating another Telecom Éireann. And that, I think, is one of the toxic legacies of telecom, is that it has soured the public on buying state assets. And that's a very great pity. That's seriously damaging, I think.
Agreed, and it's interesting, even where there have been flotations of state-owned assets in the interim. Take Aer Lingus 2006. The state held on to 25% when it did that, and it didn't hype up and market shares to the public in Aer Lingus. That lesson had been learned very quickly. Recently, when AIB refloated on the stock market, again, they didn't launch a campaign to make the Irish retail investor buy shares specifically, although they weren't precluded from doing so. I suppose another legacy has been almost 20 years of missed opportunity, misinvestment in Irish Telecom's infrastructure to a degree, leading to where we are in terms of the whole broadband debate now, and who needs to pay for it.
Exactly. I mean, this country's telecoms infrastructure, I think, is not as modern and as efficient as it should be, given that we claim to be one of the sort of major outposts of Silicon Valley. It's actually pretty poor. And one of the reasons for that is because of what happened to Telecom Éireann. It was the big non-investor in telecoms over the last 20 years, and it shows. And just on the question of Aer Lingus, and retaining the 25% stake in Aer Lingus was a very smart thing to do, because it allowed the government to play an essential role when British Airways came in to bid for Aer Lingus. I thought, and I don't hold a candle for the government, but I thought that they played a blinder during the takeover by British Airways and IAG, the parent, and extracted maximum value, and also at the same time found a very good ownership structure for Aer Lingus within IAG.
One of the positive lessons learned, I suppose, and the other one being, I suppose, there was a trend developing at the time of the Telecom Éireann flotation that because civil service employees effectively were now moving into a private sector world, they were effectively granted nearly 15% of telecom and of other companies. They did very well out of the telecom deal over time, but that trend has disappeared as well now, because we're not going to privatise many companies from now on.
Yes, I mean, there's actually very little left to privatise in Europe, generally speaking. I mean, France has privatised a lot of enterprises, so has Britain. Italy has done so, although it's still probably the one country where there are a lot of heavy assets, and by heavy I mean oil and gas and things like that, in state hands that probably would be better off fully privatised and in the stock market. But certainly in Western Europe, there's very little left to privatise. And I think that, most privatisations of telecom assets in the last 25 years have been quite successful in Spain, in France, in England, in many other countries. And one cannot imagine in 2019 sort of relying on the government to provide you with a telephone. I mean, my parents in the 1970s, they were on a waiting list for a phone for 7 years from the Department of Posts and Telegraphs. Now it takes 7 minutes.
Yeah, the world has changed. We leave it there. Vincent Boland, journalist and commentator on business and finance. Vincent, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Vincent.
Taking Stock on News Talk.
Thanks to Skillnet Ireland, driving business success through innovative training and upskilling.